Okay, that was a good intro. This is going to be a fiery one. I like it. So, Witbiers. Witbiers, unlike me, are nice and refreshing. I could go for one right now, for real. They are flavorful beers, but they're also light and crushable. Or as the overall impression section of the BJCP guidelines say, they are a refreshing, elegant, tasty, moderate strength wheat-based ale. That's a short one. Short, simple description. But hey, we're already deep into this one, so a little brevity is probably a good thing. Let's see. The aroma of a wheat beer has a moderate malty sweetness with some spicy wheat aromatics, light and grainy. And there's often a bit of tartness in there too. Like some other Belgian beer styles, this one has some spice additions. So you will get a whiff of some perfumey coriander, some zesty orange peel fruitiness, and a complex herbal, spicy, or peppery note in the background. Some of that spicy herbal note may come from the hops used, but it may also be from the addition of spice or pepper. If you detect any vegetal, celery-like, or ham-like aromas, you should know that those are inappropriate for the style. For the record, there's not a beer style I know of that should have any ham-like aroma, but you never know. The spice you smell should blend in with fruity, floral, and sweet aromas, and shouldn't be overly strong. That balance is very important. Wit beers are very pale straw to very light golden color. They will appear cloudy from the suspended yeast or starch haze, as wit beers are traditionally brewed using a large proportion of unmalted wheat and a little bit of oats. That, along with the specific mashing procedure that breaks up some of the mash's enzymes, leaves you with a ton of residual starches in the beer. This will give the beer an almost milky appearance. Being wheat beers, they will have a dense, white, almost moussey looking head, and the retention of the head will be outstanding. As far as flavor goes, you're going to get a pleasant, malty sweet grain flavor and a zesty, citrusy kick. It'll come off as mostly orangey, and you might get a rich note of honey or vanilla. These beers are refreshingly crisp with a dry, often tart finish. They'll usually have a bready wheat flavor and will often have a very light sour note. More of a lactic tartness, really, than a sourness. Any herbal, spicy flavors should be subtle and balanced, not overpowering. The most common spice used is coriander, but there are plenty of variations on that. A spicy, earthy, hot flavor may be detected, but it will never get in the way of the spices. Most of the time the hops are imperceptible, and the hop bitterness is low to medium low, neither interfering with the refreshing flavors of fruit and spice, nor lingering into the finish. These beers also commonly use orange peel, but you shouldn't get any of that pithy bitterness. And the guide points out again here that any vegetal, celery-like, which is vegetable as far as I know, ham-like or soapy flavors are just as inappropriate in the flavor as they were in the aroma. I'm assuming this ham character they keep mentioning comes from the addition of coriander. I don't know what else would cause such a strange flavor in a wit beer. This one time when I had my dad, who's a dedicated bush drinker, try a wit beer, a Hoegaarden, he told me it tasted like hot dogs. I told him his palate was fucked, but later I realized that hot dogs are chock full of coriander, so my dad wasn't wrong. That just sounds weird coming out of my mouth. Please don't tell him I said that. He'll never let me live it down. The body on these bad boys is medium light to medium, often with a smoothness and creaminess from the addition of unmalted wheat and or oats. Despite this creamy body, wit beers finish dry and often a little tart. They have an effervescent character from their high levels of carbonation. The finish is refreshing, lightly acidic and clean, not bitter. You won't get any harshness or astringency from the orange peel. These beers should not be overly dry and thin, nor should they be thick and heavy. The presence, character, and degree of spicing and lactic sourness varies, but any overly spiced version or any overly sour version is not a good example of the style. That's not to say it isn't a delicious beer, it's just an atypical wit beer. There's nothing wrong with bending the rules, or even ignoring some rules altogether. And here the guideline says that coriander of certain origins does indeed contribute an inappropriate ham or celery character, so that is confirmed. Witbiers, or wits, I don't know why I haven't been calling them that the whole time, but wits do not age particularly well, so you want to drink them as fresh as possible, which is true of most beer styles. As far as the history of Witbier goes, it is a Belgian style, as I mentioned in the intro, before I got all anti-capitalist on you. It was originally brewed by monks, go figure, from around the 14th century, whereas different regional monasteries produced their own versions of the style. The area in and around Leuven became particularly known for their Witbiers. Leuven is 16 miles east of Brussels, and it is also the home of Interbrew, who merged in 2004 with Ambev to form InBev, which then merged with Anheuser-Busch in 2008 to form AB InBev. But that's not Witbier history, that's just the history of Leuven. Long before Interbrew, the area around Leuven was making exceptional witbiers using local ingredients, including barley, wheat, and oats. This was also before hops were widely used in beer, so these wits were bittered with a gruit instead. I've talked about gruit before. It's just a mix of herbs and spices that bitter the beer, much the same way hops do. In the 16th century, brewers in the nearby town of Hoegaarden started a guild, which led to a flourishing witbier scene that lasted into the 19th century. Of course, by the end of that century, lagers had taken over most of Europe. Belgium held out longer than most countries, but even they couldn't hold back the push for crisp, clean lagers. So, whereas at one point there were roughly 30 breweries in Hoegaarden, all making witbiers, by 1960 there were precisely 0. Enter a dude named Pierre Celis. He worked as a milkman in the town of Hoegaarden, but he was also fascinated with brewing. He had a particular interest in the cloudy wheat beers he remembered from his youth, so at age 40, Celis began homebrewing, first out of a wash tub from his father's barn, and later with some janky old equipment he bought from a defunct brewery. But he had passion, and his passion helped him overcome any obstacles, financial or otherwise. In 1966, he opened the De Cluis brewery, and by 1989 he was brewing nearly 8 million gallons of wheat beer a year, and still not keeping up with demand. That was also the year his underinsured facility burned down, leaving him in quite a tough spot. As a result, he took an offer from good old Interbrew to oversee the production of a newer, bigger, better facility, the Hoegaarden Brewery. So Celis was able to keep making wit beer, but over time, dealing with CEOs ended up being something he just wasn't into. So in 1982, he sold his shares in the company and moved to America, to Austin. But he didn't retire. No, he was just starting over, in his mid-60s. Celis smuggled in some of the original yeast he used to create his first wit beer, and using that and some local ingredients, he created Celis White, the flagship beer of his new brewery, the Celis Brewery. He set about educating the locals on hazy Belgian-style beers, and by 1995 he was producing 16,000 barrels a year. But, as is so often the way it goes for this guy, he was unable to keep up with demand. As a result, he was forced, once again, to partner with one of the big guys. He signed a 5-year contract with Miller Brewing, which is now Miller Coors, but macro beer companies being what they are, they kept pushing Celis to sacrifice the quality of his ingredients to allow for more mass production. And again, when the 5-year contract was up, Celis forfeited his remaining share to the beer conglomerate. Miller ceased production of the Celis brand that same year. Then, in the spring of 2011, Pierre Celis died. So yeah, that's a fucking downer of a story, right? But it does reinforce what I said earlier about companies being perfectly willing to fuck people over for profits. Either way, there is a bit of a happy ending here. Pierre's daughter, Christine Celis, acquired the rights to the Celis Brewery name and reopened the brewery in the June of 2017. So that's good. I mean, yes, the brewery filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in July of 2019, but we'll just keep our fingers crossed and hope that all works out for Christine and the rest of the Celis Brewing family. The last time I checked, they were still hanging in there, so that's good, I guess. But no matter what happens to the Celis Brewery, the influence of Pierre Celis is going to live on for a long time to come. Thanks to his independent spirit, the wit beer style survived extinction in the mid-60s, and now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of wit beers being produced, from Allagash White to Zywick Bialy. There are some characteristic ingredients that all wit beers share. The grist is usually made with about 50% unmalted wheat and 50% pale barley malt. Some versions use up to 10% raw oats to give the beer a more creamy character. Freshly ground coriander and orange peel complement the sweet aroma and are the most used spices in a wit beer. Some brewers use sweet orange peel, but most use a more bitter curacao orange peel. Other spices, such as chamomile, cinnamon, or even cumin, may be used for complexity, but those are much less prominent than the coriander and orange peel. Most wits use an ale yeast that produces mild, spicy flavors, and some add lactic acid to give the beer a mild tartness. This is either done by using some lactobacillus during fermentation, or by simply adding some lactic acid to the finished beer. These estuary wheat beers share their low bitterness and balance with a Weiss beer, but their spice character is very different, as it comes from spice additions rather than from the esters and phenols created by the yeast used. And yes, wits can use a bit of lactobacillus, but they are nowhere near as sour and funky as most beers that employ such methods. The tartness of a wit beer is very subtle. Moving on to vital statistics, wits have an IBU range from 8 to 20, very low on the bitterness scale. Remember, these beers didn't used to have hops in them at all. SRM is from 2 to 4, which is very light, from a straw color to a light yellow, and the ABV ranges from 4.5 to 5.5%. The most well-known example is the Blue Moon, as I said earlier, but there are so many others out there. Allagash White is one of the best around, unless you're in St. Louis, and then it's not around at all. Despite not being as good as it once was, I think the Hoegaarden White is still a great beer. Avery White Rascal is another great wit beer. Four Hands has one called Ripple that's very refreshing. That one's a little sweeter than most, but still quite tasty. And the St. Bernardus Wit, La Trappe Wit, and Blanche de Brussels are all worthy imports. And that's all I have to say about that. To quote everyone's favorite fictional dunce, Forrest Gump. I'm going to take a break, and we'll go see what Thomas has to say about wit beers. Sit tight. We'll be right back.